What's the creepiest thing that has happened to you that you still think about to this day? Story 1. When I was around 11 years old, I was at softball practice, and for whatever reason, the practice ended early, so I had to wait at the park for my grandfather to come and pick me up. I ended up having to wait alone for about 30 minutes because I did not have a cell phone to call and let my grandfather know that practice had ended early. I remember sitting on the swings when an adult man, probably in his 30s or 40s, came and sat down next to me. He asked if he knew me and I said no, and he told me that I must just have one of those pretty faces that feels recognizable to anybody. I remember feeling happy about the compliment, and I kept talking to him. Eventually, he told me that he had his car with him and that he could drive me home to my grandparents' house so that they would not have to worry about picking me up, and I would not have to wait any longer. Being 11, I did not think anything of this and proceeded to get into this stranger's car. Luckily, my grandfather showed up just in time, and I remember seeing his car and jumping out to meet him. The stranger sped off without talking to my grandfather, and that was the last I ever heard about it. This is such a vivid memory for me, and I often find myself thinking about what would have happened to me and what a different person I would be today if my grandfather had not shown up when he did. Story 2. This happened when I was 7 years old. I was walking downtown with my father, who was buying a compact disc. We used to go to the record store, and he would chat about music with the workers while I played on the Sega Dreamcast. I remember there was a man watching me play, and it looked like he was crying. He was just kind of staring at me, but because I was 7 and had a video game in front of me, I did not think much of it. About 20 minutes later, there was a group of people gathering outside, so we went out to see what the commotion was about. The man who had been crying was now on top of the roof, standing on the ledge. He screamed, "This is for you, Daniel," which is my name, and then jumped. My father put his entire body over mine to prevent me from seeing it, but the man who jumped passed away. I thought about it every day for over 20 years. Skip ahead to about 5 years ago. I was at a Christmas staff party, drinking heavily with my team. A guy on my team and I had heart-to-heart talks about our pasts, and he told me that he is bisexual, although he had not been with a man in 20 years. He used to date a man behind his girlfriend's back, and that man took his own life when he would not leave her. My coworker's name is Daniel. He was in the crowd with me that day. Two strangers forever changed together, connected by something that happened 20 years in the past. This may not be creepy to some, but it haunted me for most of my life. Story 3. I moved into a shared house, and my housemate told me that half the house had burned down and been rebuilt, and that the ghost of the old man who had passed away in the fire sometimes visited them. I never had any experience with the old man, but when half asleep, I would very clearly feel a cat or two jump onto my bed, settle down, and purr. It happened often, it was quite calm, and I did not mind. I would even hear the distinctive thump of a cat jumping off the bed from time to time, but there was never a physical cat there. Once in that house, but in a different bedroom, I had a terrifying lucid dream in which a possum-like or cat-like clawed hand was coming up from inside my bed, clawing at my thigh. It hurt so much I thought I might be scratching myself in my sleep, but I woke up unharmed. Months later, I moved out and met the landlord, who lived a few doors down, to return the keys. I said something like, "It must have been scary when the house burned down and the owner was killed. Were they living there at the time?" He said, "Oh no, the owner was fine. He got out. But he had about a dozen cats and several of them died in the fire. I am pretty sure I was sharing my bed with ghost cats. I am not sure what the dream was about, but I have had a couple of lucid dreams in my time, and they have always been incredibly frightening." Story 4. I was camping in the Simpson Desert on a multi-day trip. It was a very remote location, and although we had not planned on stopping there, it was getting late, and one of the trailers had blown a tire, so we decided to repair it and then call it a day. Being so remote, there were no signs for anything, but according to our map, the land we were on belonged to the military, probably for training purposes. We did not think much of it at the time, but looking back, I dare say we should not have been there. It added to the eerie, desolate feeling of the area. After dinner, we were all stargazing. There were so many meteorites and satellites whizzing around. It was fantastic. I remember watching one satellite move very slowly, much slower than the rest. Then I noticed another not far from it, moving very slowly in the same direction. I pointed it out to the group, and we all watched these two slow satellites almost following each other. Then the first one suddenly made a hard right turn, and we were all shocked. The one behind it did the same thing, and they continued to follow each other before both turned again. I could not explain it at the time, and it really unsettled me. I have no idea what it was. I am not one to believe in conspiracies or aliens, but that experience still stays with me. The only logical explanation I can come up with, which helps me sleep better at night, is that they were geostationary satellites changing altitudes or orbits. But I am no space expert, and to this day, I truly have no clue what I saw that night. Story 5. I took an Uber at around 11 o'clock at night to get to my house. Halfway through the ride, the driver started taking random turns into smaller streets, saying it was because of traffic. At that point, we were not even moving toward my destination anymore. I politely asked him to follow the directions that Google Maps was suggesting, to which he told me to shut up. He then ended the trip in the Uber app, but would not stop the car or let me out. This happened in India, where the police are not very reliable. I had pepper spray with me. My friends used to laugh about how I always carried it everywhere, and I started spraying in his direction. He crashed the car, and I ran out. What still bothers me is that Uber takes away the SOS option after the driver ends the trip. The driver also knows where you live, so even if you take action, he could still harm you. The worst part was that no one seemed to care. When I told my parents or my friends, they found ways to blame me for it. Maybe I was rude to him. Maybe I overreacted. It made me realize what so many women and men go through after even more serious trauma, and how easily victims are blamed instead of supported. Story 6. I cannot really remember how old I was, maybe 8 or 9 years old, but I was walking to school when an older man, probably in his 60s, came walking in the opposite direction. I remember thinking he looked strange because it was early. The daylight was dim, yet he was wearing sunglasses. It was not cold, but he had on a long black trench coat. I stepped off the sidewalk to go around him, keeping out of arm's reach, because even my young mind sensed that he was not someone I wanted near me. It turns out I was right. He suddenly started kicking leaves and throwing mulch at me from a nearby garden. I was too frightened to register what he was shouting, but he was grunting something. I sprinted for about 2 blocks until I reached the crossing guard in front of my school. At first, I thought about keeping it to myself, but the fear haunted me all day until I finally told my parents. We filed a police report, but I have no idea what happened to him afterward. Story 7. When I was in elementary school, my brother, my friends, and I would ride bikes around our apartment complex. One time, a man in a station wagon drove up and tried to offer us leftover Halloween candy. He kept trying to get us closer so we could pick out what we wanted. We thought he was weird, but treated it as a joke. So we all ran away yelling, "Stranger danger," like we had seen in school videos. A couple of months later, the same man pulled up to us asking for directions. We told him we barely knew our way around because we were just kids, but he kept trying to get us closer to point on his map where we were. Again, we ran away jokingly, yelling for help. It was not until the third time that he approached us, months later, that we truly got scared. This time he offered us a ride home and even got out of the station wagon, saying he wanted to put our bikes inside his car. We panicked and started actually yelling for help while speeding toward my friend's house. His mother leaned out the kitchen window to see what was happening, and the man jumped back into his car and sped away. Now, as an adult, I sometimes wonder if there were missing children reports in my hometown during the 1990s connected to men like him. Story 8. I used to spend a lot of time walking through the woods and fields near my mother's house. One day I noticed a path I had never seen before. I was listening to music while following the trail, which grew narrower as the trees became denser. It was clear that not many people had walked there recently, as it was more of a muddy gravel track. At that point, I was deep in the woods, shaded by the trees, and had not seen another person for a long time. I first noticed something unusual when I smelled smoke. I stopped on the path, and only a few meters away, in the trees to my left, I saw a small fire that had obviously been stamped out in a hurry. There were still embers glowing and smoke rising, so it had been extinguished only moments before. That was when I realized that whoever had put it out might still be hiding nearby. watching me. I have never felt such an intense gut feeling to run. I sprinted straight back the way I had come and did not look behind me until I reached the main woodland trail where people were around. I will never know if I was just paranoid or if I truly avoided something dangerous that day. Story 9. I was at an internal work event at a fancy hotel in another state. It was 1980s themed. I started talking to a man since I barely knew anyone there and was trying to network, and he told me he did not work for my company. I laughed it off and made a joke about free food. He stared me straight in the eyes, picked up one of my French fries off my plate, dipped it in ketchup, and ate it without saying a word. I freaked out, threw the rest of my food in the trash, and walked out of the room, deciding not to think about it. A few minutes later, there he was, staring at me again. I changed rooms, and since I am short, I hid behind people and pretended to chat with coworkers I vaguely recognized from my home office. Every few minutes, I noticed him following me. Eventually, I gathered the courage to approach a woman I knew from meetings. When I asked if the party had security, she immediately asked if it was about the man in the blue jacket and white hat. She had already noticed him staring at me, so I did not have to explain. Security escorted him away and everyone moved on, but I was shaken and paranoid for the rest of the trip. Story 10. When I was 16, I went to Tampa with a friend. We were staying in a rundown hotel with a pool. That evening, we decided to go for a swim. It was just us and a table of adults with a little boy. We were on the opposite side of the pool when the boy ran over and started talking to us. It was obvious he was lonely, and the adults were not paying attention to him. He was probably around 7 years old. We chatted casually, and then, out of nowhere, he asked if we liked vodka. It startled me, because I am not sure I even knew what vodka was at his age. I told him no, we did not drink. He said his parents let him have sips of their drinks, and they would let us drink if we went back to their room. That is when I felt truly creeped out. My friend and I immediately left the pool and ran back to our room. Maybe the child was just odd, but I strongly felt that the adults were trying to lure us into their room through him. Story 11. I once saw my ex-stepmother in a grocery store. She rushed over, pretending to miss me, and acting overly friendly despite the past. She was with a man I had never met before. Since I live in a small town, I didn't want to cause a scene, so I stayed still as she pulled me into a hug. Then the man also hugged me for longer than felt comfortable, touching my hair and making comments about it. I gave an awkward push-away gesture, and he eventually let go, though he lingered a little too much. Thankfully, a kind woman working at the butcher counter invited me to come into the back with her, under the excuse of looking for meat I had supposedly asked for, though I had not. Usually, I would never go into a secluded staff area with a stranger holding a knife, but I happily followed her. I stayed there for about 10 minutes until I felt it was safe, thanked her, and bolted. I did not even buy the pepperoni I had come for. I just wanted to escape. I will never forget that woman. I sometimes wish I could thank her properly for saving me from that disturbing encounter, but I do not want her to get in trouble for bending the rules. Story 12. When I was about 8 years old, I lived in a quiet neighborhood and often went for walks around the block, sometimes alone, sometimes with my mother. One evening before sunset, my best friend and I decided to take a walk together. About halfway around, an older man approached us, walking 2 dogs. He was panting, seemed frantic, and asked us if we knew whose dogs they were. We said no and tried to keep walking quickly because something about him gave us goosebumps. He followed us, insisting we should help him find their owners by knocking on neighbors' doors. We continued to say no and sped up, but he matched our pace, calling out, "Let's check this house and help me find their owners." At that point, we sprinted back to my house. He chased us for a short distance, but quickly tired out. To this day, I do not know if he was simply socially awkward and did not realize 2 young girls were not the right people to ask, or if his plan was something far worse. I am just glad our instincts told us to run home. Story 13. I used to work as a dispatcher and call taker for 911 in a moderately sized city. I was working an overnight shift once when we suddenly started receiving a huge number of calls about unidentified flying objects over the area. It was a weeknight in the summer, and lots of people who were out walking, drinking, or spending time outside began reporting the same thing. Altogether, we probably took around 100 calls about the objects, and for reference, I might normally handle 300 or 400 calls myself during an entire shift. Since I was the supervisor on duty that night, I took over trying to resolve the matter so the other dispatchers could focus on the regular emergencies that were still coming in. We had a direct emergency line, a hot phone, to the airport air traffic control tower that was meant for use during air emergencies. I had to use it once before when there was a plane crash, and that was one of the most terrifying experiences of my career. When I contacted them about the unidentified objects, though, they had no idea what was going on and seemed reluctant to get involved. After some time, I managed to get through to a hotline for the Federal Aviation Administration. They definitely had a written policy for unidentified flying objects, but all they wanted was to collect information. They offered nothing in return, did not share anything with me, and the whole conversation felt more like they were interrogating me. I ended up leaving my badge number instead of my name. Eventually, I managed to reach a duty officer at an Air Force base located relatively close by. He told me they were aware of the situation, that they were monitoring it, and that I should consider the matter a closed issue. The whole situation was surreal, and it honestly felt like I was an extra in the opening scene of the movie Independence Day. This all happened before neighborhood social media groups, so there was not the same kind of online discussion that you would see today. Still, the local radio stations put up lots of pictures of the strange lights on their websites afterward, and it remains one of the strangest shifts I ever worked. Story 14. In 1996, I was living in a small northern Canadian town, working on the oil rigs as a low-level laborer. I was 20 years old, just starting out, couch surfing from place to place, when a friend offered me a room in his mother's house. The room was in the unfinished basement with no windows. His mother was on disability and he and his brother more or less managed the house. I set up down there with a second-hand mattress, a small television, and a fan. At the time, I thought of myself as a tough guy. I partied a lot, got into fights, acted macho, and generally tried to prove myself, so I was not the type of young man who admitted to being squeamish. But after a while of living down there, I began to hear things. It was not the normal creaking of the house, pipes shifting, or wind outside. What I heard was a soft, unsettling chuckling in my ear, as if someone were whispering laughter directly to me. It repeated over and over, and I began to think I was losing my mind. On top of that, I had brought some of my favorite books with me and placed them on a shelf in the basement. More than once, I would go upstairs to use the bathroom, and when I came back down, the books had fallen onto the floor, even though no one else had been down there. The laughter in my ear grew so overwhelming that one night I finally gave in and went upstairs. Despite my tough image, I asked my friend if I could sleep on the floor in his room. To my surprise, he did not laugh at me or make fun of me. This was a place where people went to strip clubs for fun and then got into fights in the snow afterward, so I expected ridicule. Instead, he just let me stay. The next day, he casually told me that his cousin Brent had also tried sleeping down there and could not handle it, so he moved out quickly. Brent was someone I knew from around town, so I asked him about it later. He gave me a dead serious look and said, "Yeah, man, that room is haunted." After that, I only went back into the basement once more, and that was to move my belongings out. I ended up sharing a place in a trailer park with another buddy. I still think about those nights when I heard the laughter and saw my books fall, and to this day, I cannot explain what happened in that basement room. Story 15. I came home one Friday night after school when I was about 15 or 16 years old. It was winter, so it got dark quite early. The house was empty since my parents always worked late on Fridays, and my brother had football practice after school. When I arrived, I went upstairs to my bedroom, which was directly above the kitchen, and changed into my pajamas. Not long after that, I distinctly heard the kitchen door closing. It was not slammed or anything, just closed in a normal way. This particular door was the one leading from the kitchen out to the back of the house, and it made a very recognizable sound. At first, I assumed it was my brother arriving home early, or maybe my grandmother, who sometimes came over without warning. I expected to hear footsteps or someone calling out, but there was nothing. After a few minutes, I started feeling uneasy. I stepped out of my room, stood at the top of the stairs, and called for my brother and grandmother. No one answered. I began walking downstairs slowly. When I got halfway, I stopped and faced the living room. The kitchen was to my left. That is when I suddenly heard heavy breathing, like someone who had just run a marathon. The sound was coming from the kitchen. I froze on the stairs for at least a minute, trying to decide if it was my imagination or not. Then, just as suddenly, the breathing stopped. My fear spiked, and I ran back upstairs. I grabbed a random object from my room to use as a weapon. I think it was my bedside lamp, just in case someone really was inside the house. Summoning more courage than I usually have in situations like that, I went back downstairs to check. I searched the living room, the bathroom, and finally the kitchen. Everything looked perfectly normal. There was no one there, and nothing seemed disturbed. The only thing unusual was that the back door was unlocked. In my family, we always made sure both the front and back doors were locked when leaving the house, but someone must have forgotten. That unlocked door meant I could not rule out the possibility that someone had come in while I was upstairs, even if just for a short while. It still unsettles me when I think about it, because I have no explanation for the breathing I heard that night. Story 16. I grew up on a cattle ranch in what was once a rural town. Our house sat alone in the middle of a 200-acre plot of land, surrounded by a few small neighborhoods and some other farms. There was a pasture light just outside the yard, visible from the living room. As a kid and teenager, I had a habit of waking up in the middle of the night and walking through the house to check that the windows and doors were closed. It was the 1990s in a small town, and we did not always lock our doors. For me, it was just a routine that helped me get back to sleep, and my dad had the same habit. One night when I was about 14, I was doing my usual checks when I looked out the window at the pasture light. There, standing under the blue glow, was a lone man. He was just standing there staring at the house. I froze in shock and then quickly ducked down below the windowsill, hoping he had not seen me. I waited only a few seconds before peeking again, but he was gone. I told my dad and he shrugged it off, saying that people often walked across our pasture because we were between two major roads, usually homeless people or locals without cars. After that night, though, I made sure the doors were locked every single time. Story 17. When my grandparents passed away, my family moved into their house to help take care of my uncle, who had special needs and had lived there his whole life. The house always gave me creepy vibes, and while living there, I had frequent nightmares. One evening, I had the most terrifying nightmare of my life, and it felt incredibly real. Toward the end of the dream, I saw a horrifying demon grinning at me. It had completely black, empty eyes, hundreds of sharp teeth curled into a smile, and pale, cracked skin that looked like bone. Just by its smile, it somehow made me feel certain that it was going to kill me. The dream left me so shaken that I did not want to sleep for weeks, afraid of seeing that thing again. I did not tell anyone in my family about the dream. The next day, my uncle, with whom I rarely spoke because we did not get along, asked me out of nowhere if I still had that ghost hunting app on my phone. I had downloaded an electromagnetic field reading app a few weeks earlier as a joke, since the house always felt creepy, and I wanted to see if anything would show up. I told him yes and asked why. He said, "I was just wondering because last night I saw something standing in my doorway." Then he described the exact same demon I had seen in my nightmare. I was so horrified I could barely respond. When I finally told my family, they agreed something strange was happening in the house. None of us slept well after that. Thankfully, we did not live there for long before selling it, but I still think about that nightmare. My uncle could not have known what I had dreamt, since I had told no one. I fully believe he saw the same demon I saw, only in person, while mine appeared in my dreams. Story 18. When I was in the early years of secondary school, around 12 to 14 years old, my mother asked me to return a bag of sugar to our elderly neighbor. She had lent us some the weekend before. I was feeling lazy and bratty, and I did not want to talk to anyone, but I went anyway. I walked up to her front door, which had a timber frame and a frosted glass panel, and knocked. Through the glass, I saw a figure walking down the hallway toward the door. At that moment, I decided I really did not want to chat, so I quietly placed the bag of sugar on the doorstep and ran back home without saying anything. I also did not mention it to my mother. 3 days later, our neighbor came over and asked if we had noticed anything strange around our house recently. My mother replied that I had dropped off the sugar, thinking we had spoken then. I had to admit that I had been rude, leaving the sugar and running off. That was when our neighbor explained that 3 days earlier, her house alarm had gone off because her house was robbed. She had actually been out of town and forgot to tell us. The person I had seen walking toward the door through the frosted glass was not her, but the burglars. To this day, I still think about how lucky I was that I did not stick around. My intuition told me to leave. And because I did, I might have avoided a very dangerous situation. Story 19. Our neighbor was notoriously known for having frequent fights. So frequent that almost every night you could hear them screaming their lungs out at each other. One night I was outside minding my own business when I heard them starting another fight. At first I rolled my eyes because the yelling was about the husband being drunk again. A few more minutes passed, and then I heard loud crashes as they started throwing things around their house. Soon after that, I heard the wife shout angrily, "You did what?" I assumed he must have done something really bad to make her that furious. After that, their voices became harder to understand, and I could not quite make out what was happening. Then suddenly, the wife's screaming changed. It turned into terrified cries. She started yelling, "Get away from me! And let me go!" I froze, realizing this was no longer the usual drunken argument. I thought about calling the police, but apparently someone else had already done it because a patrol car pulled up in front of their house. At first, I assumed it was just a noise complaint from another neighbor. The moment the police arrived, all the yelling and fighting inside stopped. I thought it was over. But a few days later, when I came home from school, I saw 3 police cars parked in front of their house. The husband was in handcuffs being led away. I thought maybe the wife had finally reported him for domestic violence. When I got inside, my parents were watching from the window. I asked what was happening, and my mom said a neighbor had told her the man had murdered his wife and dismembered her. I was in total shock. Later that evening, the local news confirmed it. The report said the man had hidden her body in their laundry room, covering it with powdered soap to conceal the smell. It was horrifying to learn that I had been living next to someone capable of such a thing. It still creeps me out to this day. Sometimes I imagine if he had gone on a rampage, what could have happened to us? It felt like living through a real-life horror story, the closest I have ever been to one. Story 20. In my teens and early 20s, my best friend and I had countless sleepovers. His mom worked the night shift as a nurse, and his younger brother usually stayed in his room and went to bed early, so the house was basically ours. We would cook dinner, watch television, talk for hours, and we had a tradition we called night walks. Around 11 o'clock or midnight, we would head out for 2 to 3 hours. Summer nights were the best, with warm air, cool breezes, and the smell of fields and pastures all around. There was one particular route we walked often. Toward the end, we had to cross a big forest. Once we emerged, we would reach a hill that overlooked the city. There was a bench there where we sometimes sat to relax, enjoy the silence, and look at the distant lights before heading home. One night we followed this routine. Walking through the forest was always a little unsettling, so once we got out, my friend suggested we rest on the bench for a while. We crossed the meadow about 20 meters and sat down. The bench was surrounded by trees and bushes on 3 sides with the city view in front. We stayed for maybe 20 or 25 minutes, smoking and talking about random things like space and philosophy. Eventually, my friend said he was getting cold since it was late fall, probably October or November, and suggested we leave. We started walking back toward the trail when my friend asked if I had the lighter. I thought he had picked it up, but he thought I had. So we went back to the bench to look for it. We felt around the wooden surface in the dark, but could not find it. My friend pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight to help. He swept the light around casually, and that was when we saw him. There was a man sitting on the ground directly behind the bench. He was only about 2 meters away, dressed completely in black, sitting motionless on the cold, wet ground, staring straight at us. We realized he must have been sitting there silently the entire time we were on the bench, staring at the back of our heads. The realization made my skin crawl. Startled, my friend nervously laughed and said, "Man, you almost gave us a heart attack. What are you doing there?" The man said nothing. We asked again, "Why are you sitting there?" No response. "Are you okay?" Still nothing. He just sat there watching us. The silence was unbearable, and something about him felt wrong. My gut twisted with dread, and later my friend told me he felt the exact same way. Then suddenly the man stood up and began walking toward us. I asked, "What's happening?" That was when he finally spoke. All he said was, "Yeah." He started walking around the bench toward us. My friend grabbed my coat and whispered urgently, "Let's get out of here." We began walking backward, not wanting to turn our backs on him. Then we turned and ran until we had put 100 meters between us and the bench. When we looked back, we were relieved to see he had not followed. Still, we hurried all the way home. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or why he sat there in silence for nearly half an hour. I do not know what he wanted or what he might have done if we had stayed. All I know is that my instincts screamed at me to run, and I am grateful we listened. Story 21. My boyfriend and I went to order takeaway pizza before leaving on a vacation trip. We were carrying a good amount of cash with us, and I was too scared to leave it inside the car. We were in a not-so-safe area of Mexico City, where it was not uncommon for someone to smash car windows to steal things. So instead, I put the money in my jeans pocket, which in hindsight was just as risky. We went inside the pizza place and ordered. While we were waiting, a man outside kept staring directly at us. We were the only customers there. He began pacing around the restaurant from the outside, making a phone call, and still turning to look at us. Fear settled in my chest that he was calling someone to come and help him rob the place. But I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. I did not mention it to my boyfriend, but he could tell from my face that something was wrong. After a few minutes, the man crossed the street and disappeared, which gave me a moment of relief. But 3 minutes later, he returned, this time greeting another man on a bike right outside. That man also began staring directly at us and then entered the place with an intimidating demeanor. At that moment, I resigned myself to what I thought was about to happen, convinced he was seconds away from pulling out a gun. I had never felt so hopeless and scared in my life. Once inside, though, the man looked uneasy, almost like he was hesitating. My boyfriend whispered that we should make a run for the car. I was terrified of doing that, especially since the first man was still outside like a lookout. But just then, my boyfriend noticed him looking away for a moment, and he grabbed my arm and pulled me. We ran. Luckily, the car was only half a block away. The worst thing that happened that night was that we paid for our pizza, but never picked it up. I will never know if we were actually in danger or if it was just a strange coincidence, but we were not going to stay there and find out. Story 22. One year, my family and I stayed in Michigan with my aunt and uncle, who were living there temporarily. Their house was along a bay, with no close neighbors, but some rental houses within view. It was a nice house, but something about it felt unsettling, and I was not the only one who felt it. My whole family agreed that it gave off a strange atmosphere. On our first night, there was a rental house nearby that the landlord told us was vacant that week. But my mom swore she saw the lights flickering on and off several times between 2 and 3 in the morning when she could not sleep. Another night, my oldest sister was asleep on an inflatable mattress in the guest room with my parents, while my middle sister and I were sleeping on mattresses just outside the door in the upstairs game room. My dad decided he could not relax in the house at all and went to sleep in our RV instead. Again, around 2 to 3 in the morning, my mom woke up. But this time it was because she heard someone right beside her bed whispering, "Mom, Mom, Mom," over and over, as if one of us kids was trying to wake her. She opened her eyes and said, "What?" But no one was there. She immediately woke my sister beside her to ask what she needed, but my sister was half asleep and confused, insisting she had not moved all night. My mom then checked on my other sister and me, and we were both sound asleep. We ended up cutting the trip short, deciding to stay in a hotel in town instead of spending another night there. My aunt and uncle moved not long after, and to this day, my family still talks about how unsettling that house was. No one has ever been able to explain what we experienced there. Story 23. I live in a very unsettling home. Often I hear knocking and footsteps on the wooden floors in the kitchen, even though I live alone and do not have any pets. One night in particular, I was so frightened that I thought my heart might burst from my chest. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was asleep when I was startled by a loud bang somewhere in my home. At first, I was unsure if I had dreamt it, so I stayed still, listening intently. My bedroom is at the very end of the hallway near the bathroom, with the hall leading to the living room and then wrapping around to the kitchen and back room. As I strained to hear over the loud hum of my central air system, I suddenly heard a distinct and chilling sound. Someone dragging their fingernails down the metal vent near the kitchen. The sound was sharp, deliberate, and loud. My body went into fight mode. I texted my father, telling him I thought someone might have broken in. I grabbed my pistol and flashlight, pressed myself against the wall near my open door, and listened. My heart was pounding. Then I heard small, deliberate footsteps coming from the kitchen. That was when I was sure someone was inside. Summoning all my courage, I moved into the hallway, pistol aimed. There was a pitch-black room on my left, and I leaned in cautiously, but it was empty. I crept forward toward the living room, checked, and found nothing. Finally, I turned the corner toward the kitchen, my hands trembling, sweat dripping. I flipped on the light, ready. Every single cabinet door and the oven door were standing wide open. My stomach dropped. I shouted, "If anyone is in the back room, you better show yourself." But the house was silent. Step by step, I moved toward the back room, hearing the wood floor creak under my weight. When I burst inside, it was empty. To this day, I still experience strange activity in this house. I cannot explain what I saw and heard that night, but I know it was real. It left me shaken, and I continue to live with the uneasy feeling that I am not alone. Story 24. When I was 12 years old, I am 35 now, my mom worked until 11 at night, and my sister, who was 15, was usually out with her friends. I had just made some new friends from school who lived about 2.5 miles away. On this particular day, I took the bus to their neighborhood and hung out most of the evening. It beat sitting at home alone, since my sister was usually gone most nights too. Around 9 o'clock, I started walking home. The route was along a main street, so I did not stop anywhere to use the bathroom. By the time I got home, I really had to go. When I walked into the house, all the lights were off, which was normal, but when I went upstairs, I saw that the light in my bedroom was on. It was the only light on in the whole house. That was unusual, but since I needed to pee badly, I did not think much about it. To reach the bathroom, I had to walk past my bedroom. When I looked in, I saw my sister standing at the window, wearing my white and orange polo shirt, staring out. It was strange because she had never worn my clothes before, and the window only faced an alley in the neighbor's house. Nothing to stare at. But I was in such a rush that I brushed it off. From the bathroom, I shouted at her, "Don't wear my clothes anymore." She never answered. When I came back ready to argue, my room was empty. No one was there. That was when it hit me. I was home completely alone. The house was dark and silent. Terrified, I ran downstairs as fast as I could and straight to my neighbor's house, begging to stay until my mom got home. Once inside, I used their phone to call my sister's best friend's house. Sure enough, my sister answered the phone from there. She had been there all night. That moment still haunts me. Why was she in my room? Why was it wearing my shirt? And why that particular night? I have never found an answer. Story 25. I was about 6 years old when my family went on a road trip to Uluru. We camped overnight in a small town in the Northern Territory. My mom, dad, little sister, and I were all sharing a tent, sleeping on airbeds side by side. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of the tent fly unzipping. The outer protective layer that left a small 1-meter entry space before the main body of the tent. Something rustled inside, and I froze in terror when I saw 2 hands press against the thin fabric of the tent wall. It looked as if someone was cupping their eyes to peek in. I could not move or make a sound. I just lay there in complete fear. Then I heard footsteps moving around the tent, stopping at the end where our heads were. That was when the inner zipper moved. I finally nudged my dad awake. He grabbed his pocket knife and went outside, and my mom followed with a torch. There was only one other car camping nearby, about 50 meters away, and its fire was still going. My parents told me it was probably just a kangaroo nosing around. But I knew what I saw. Those were human hands. What makes it even creepier is that just a week later, the famous British backpacker Peter Falconio was murdered in that very same region. Thinking back, my heart still races. My parents never believed me, but I know it was not an animal. Story 26. When I was 17, my dad invited me to spend the night at his girlfriend's house. He and I had been talking about supposed poltergeist activity there, things like objects falling randomly and strange noises. Since I had always been interested in the supernatural, I was eager to experience it for myself. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up on the couch to the girlfriend's cat tearing around the living room. At first, half asleep, I thought it was a rat running across the couch. But it was just the cat in a frenzy, only it was not the usual playful kind. It seemed frightened, darting its head and breathing heavily. When I touched it, it calmed slightly, but it still looked tense. Once I was awake, I got up to use the bathroom. On my way back, I heard what sounded like a television playing in one of the rooms at the end of the hall. That was strange, Since the house was dark, my dad and his girlfriend were asleep at the other end, and her children were both away, one at a friend's house, the other at reform school. I crept quietly down the hall and peeked into the room. I do not remember much of the furnishings, just that it was mostly empty with a sliding double-door closet on the far wall. The light switch did not work, but the faint light from the bathroom was enough for me to see. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was sharp, like burning wood from a campfire. That alarmed me, and I sniffed the air, worried about a fire. But as I stepped closer to the closet, I heard it again. The sound much clearer now. It was the unmistakable sound of a child crying from inside the closet. A wave of dread and sorrow washed over me, mixed with something darker, something malevolent. I turned and bolted. I grabbed the cat from the hallway and sat back down on the couch, clutching it in my lap and petting it nonstop so it would not leave me alone. I stayed like that, staring at the hallway, until I eventually fell asleep sitting upright. In the morning, I told my dad and his girlfriend what I had experienced. They were curious, but not dismissive. Still, in daylight, it felt less terrifying to talk about than it had been in the moment. Nothing further came of it, but I never slept there again. Story 27. I was once waiting in line with my mom at our usual ice cream stand when an older man slipped in behind us. He stood much too close enough that my mom noticed and subtly shifted forward, probably thinking he just didn't understand personal space. While she was speaking with the vendor, he crouched down as if adjusting his shoe and made a movement that felt deliberately intrusive. I froze in shock and glanced back, but I was too young and uncertain to say anything while my mom was mid-conversation. My mom did notice my reaction and asked what was wrong. I whispered, "That man just touched my leg." In an instant, my usually quiet, shy mom exploded into action. She swung her handbag at him and hit him 2 or 3 times square on the head before he could move. The ice cream lady came at him too, shouting like a tiger protecting her cub. He managed to get away, and by then a crowd had started to form. My mom grabbed me and hurried me home, where she explained that if anyone ever touched me like that again, it was absolutely okay to interrupt her or make a scene. That moment is burned into my memory, both terrifying and empowering. Story 28. One evening during my sophomore year of college, my friends and I went to a local music show. We spent the night drinking and dancing until my friend Em and I stepped out to the patio to cool off. While the two of us were talking about philosophy, a tall man, around 6'3", dressed head to toe in black with a black bag, pulled up a chair and joined us. He said he was a PhD philosophy student at our university. He was articulate, but something about him felt off. At one point, he casually mentioned working in adult films, specifically group scenes, which added to the discomfort. Still, we kept chatting until our friends announced they were leaving. He walked with us a few blocks before we split off to help another friend retrieve her towed car. Hours later, when we returned to our apartment complex, we found our group outside, and the stranger was there too. I wondered why, but brushed it off as a coincidence. All of us ended up in my studio apartment building, where several of us lived. We were drinking, smoking, and passing around drawings as we often did. His drawings, however, were disturbing, usually explicit and bloody, which changed the mood. By 3 or 4 in the morning, most people left. When I said I was going to bed, he asked if he could crash on my couch, saying he had nowhere to stay, and it was too cold outside. Against my better judgment, I let him stay. Though luckily, some of my friends decided to crash too, so I would not be alone with him. None of us slept much. The next morning, I insisted everyone leave because I had class. He dragged his feet, clearly hoping to be the last one there, but my friends waited him out until he finally left. We all talked about how creepy he was, and I realized how foolish it had been to let him stay. That night, my friends and I were hanging out in another apartment in the same building. Around 2 in the morning, I went downstairs to my own place with a friend and a male roommate. When I reached for the doorknob, it turned from the inside. The stranger stood in the doorway. He calmly said, "Oh, you scared me." I demanded to know why he was in my apartment. He claimed he was in the area and assumed I would let him stay again. As he moved toward me, my female friend slipped into my kitchen and grabbed a knife, trembling in fear. I told him firmly that he needed to leave, but he argued, saying he would have to sleep on the street. The standoff dragged on until we threatened to call the police. He stared into my eyes for what felt like forever, shaking with rage. He slipped his hand under his jacket as if reaching for something, closed his eyes, exhaled heavily, and then suddenly turned and walked out without another word. We later learned how he got in. He had convinced a neighbor to let him inside the building by pretending to be my friend. That detail made everything even scarier. Days later, I remembered an earlier incident, seeing a tall man dressed in black standing silently in my university library, staring in my direction until a staff member escorted him out. I am certain now it was him. To this day, I cannot stop thinking about what might have happened if my friend had not left her charger in my apartment that night, forcing us to return together. And the most unsettling detail? His name was Hunter. Story 29. I was a hostess at a major chain restaurant on a busy tourist street in downtown Orlando, right before Christmas in 2018. Since I relied on the bus, I often arrived hours early just in case of delays. One day I realized I had forgotten my lighter at home when I walked out of a Walgreens across from work. I noticed a man smoking outside and asked if I could borrow his. He did not look homeless, though he seemed lonely. Since it was almost Christmas, I sat and chatted with him until my shift. He seemed like an okay guy, told me some stories, said he was a veteran but had never been to war. He seemed harmless enough, so I gave him my number, told him we could be friends, and went to work. I do not usually make friends easily, and what happened next still makes me wary of trying. Over the next week, we only talked a little. We smoked together once, but he got clingy, so I started backing off. On Christmas Eve, he asked to hang out, but I had to work a double shift. He texted me right as I clocked in, saying he would be waiting outside Walgreens for me. I never agreed to this, so I ignored it and turned my phone off. When I finished my shift and turned my phone back on, I found several texts and a couple of voicemails from him. At first, he sounded sweet, asking where I was and saying he was still waiting on the bench. But soon the messages became graphic and disturbing, describing in detail how he wanted to hurt me. I had a panic attack right there. Luckily, the police were already on scene for another matter, so my manager had them talk to me. Nothing came of it. I did not know his real name, even though I had his number. Several employees had seen us together before, and I had saved voicemails with threats, but still, nothing was done. I kept his number saved in my phone as do not answer. Every so often he would text me as if he thought I had forgotten. It got so bad I eventually changed my number, but I still sometimes feel that dread, like one day that phone will ring again. Story 30. The first apartment my wife and I rented together had a strange atmosphere from the moment we moved in. It was in a Victorian building with 12 units. It was at the very top of what we could afford, but we loved the look of it. Still, from the beginning, something about the place just felt off. We rarely saw any of our neighbors. In the months we lived there, we only saw two of them in passing, once each. We shared a wall with a young couple and their baby. We met them briefly a few weeks after moving in, but we never saw them again. Despite knowing they had a baby, we never once heard it cry. We could hear their television, occasional conversation, toilets flushing, but never the baby. A stroller often sat at the end of the hallway, and sometimes it would move, but we never saw anyone come or go with it. Months into the lease, we briefly chatted with a woman down the hall, exchanged pleasantries, and that was that. The very next time we came home, her apartment door was open, the place was empty, and the manager was cleaning it for new tenants. We never saw her move out, never saw anyone move in, and never saw the unit shown to prospective renters. It was as if people appeared and disappeared without warning. On top of that, things in the apartment would fling themselves across the room. Not just tipping over, actually flying. Sometimes the remote would launch itself from the coffee table. Sometimes the shampoo bottles would fly off the bathtub ledge. The most shocking incident happened when I left a bowl of uncooked rice on the kitchen counter. I was across the room talking to my wife when the entire bowl suddenly flew off with force, slammed into the sink, and sent rice scattering everywhere. There was no wind, no one nearby. We loved the apartment's charm and location, but the constant sense of unease grew unbearable. By the time we moved out, we were convinced something about that building, and our apartment in particular, was deeply wrong. Cute design and good location were not worth the constant feeling that something unseen was watching us. Story 31. When I was about 6 years old, my parents bowled in a league at my great-uncle's bowling alley. This was the early 1980s, and things were very different. We were allowed to run around and play for hours without being checked on. I could even go to the bar by myself to order Shirley Temples. My brother, who was 8, and I would spend most of our time in the arcade. One night, a tall, skinny white man with long brown hair, wearing a jean jacket and jeans, stood at the entrance to the bar. He stopped us and asked if we wanted quarters for the arcade. I said no, because I knew better. But my brother eagerly said yes. Something about the man felt off, so I refused to leave my brother alone with him. The man gave us both quarters and we ran to the arcade. I did not use mine, instead giving them to my brother after his ran out. When his quarters were gone again, my brother said he was going back to ask for more. I told him not to, reminding him we were not supposed to talk to strangers, but he ignored me and went anyway. I followed to make sure nothing happened. I wanted to find my dad, but I was too afraid to leave my brother alone. When my brother ran out of quarters a second time, he went back again, and again I followed. This time the man handed quarters to my brother, but pretended to dig around in his pockets for mine. My brother ran off, leaving me there. The man kneeled down, grabbed my hand and said, "Let's take a walk around the building," while trying to pull me toward the bar door. I yanked my hand back and screamed as loud as I could, eyes squeezed shut. Within moments, my great-uncle scooped me up. I told him a man had tried to take me, and everyone rushed outside to search. But the man was gone. The police were called, but they never caught him. As an adult, I am certain that if the man had wanted my brother would have gone with him willingly. I believe that man had probably been watching us beforehand, waiting for the right opportunity. I sometimes wonder if the only reason he did not succeed was because family was working behind the counter and got to me quickly. I also wonder if he ever did succeed in taking another child after I screamed. I wish I had closure, to know he had been caught and never hurt anyone else. Story 32. When I was about 10 years old, I got off the school bus and started walking toward my neighbor's house. My driveway was right across the road, so most days I would stop by to play basketball with my sister and the 2 boys who lived there. That particular day, my sister wanted to go home, so I stayed behind by myself. The boys I usually played with were not outside, so I went to the front door and knocked. No one answered. Suddenly, a man I had never seen before walked up a hill beside the house and greeted me. I asked where the boys were, and he claimed to be their older brother. This was strange because I had never heard them mention having another sibling. He said they had gone out for the day and asked if I could help him. Curious, I asked what was wrong. The family had lots of animals, a chinchilla, and recently horses. The man said one of their bunnies had gotten loose and he needed help finding it. I followed him down to where he claimed it had escaped, but something about him felt off. He was acting strangely, and I was uneasy because I did not know him. Then he told me we needed to hide so the bunny would come out and suggested I crawl under the porch in the back of the house. Even at 10 years old, I knew the plan was ridiculous. I made an excuse, saying I had homework to do, wished him luck finding the animal, and started heading home. To this day, I still do not know who that man was. I never asked the boys about him. They still have animals at that house, even horses now, but I never went back there to play again. The memory still unsettles me. Story 33. When I was in middle school, my dad's stepmom, Charlotte, really got into ghost hunting. This was before all the television shows and mainstream fascination with it. For her, it meant going to supposedly haunted places at night, taking pictures with digital cameras and checking them later for signs of paranormal activity. She had all sorts of stories. Floppy disks getting corrupted, spirits following her home, strange happenings. While I often rolled my eyes, I'll admit that some of the pictures she showed us were interesting. It also became a fun, if spooky, bonding experience. One night, my mom, Charlotte, my Aunt Crystal, my cousin Maria, and I went ghost hunting at an old cemetery in our town. It's the oldest cemetery in the area and tied to many ghost stories. It used to sit right next to a Catholic orphanage that also had a reputation for being haunted, though the orphanage was torn down years ago. We walked through the cemetery, taking pictures, reading headstones, and listening to Charlotte's stories. While she spoke, Aunt Crystal, Maria, and I sat down on a low stone wall while my mom and Charlotte stood nearby. We were chatting casually when, in the blink of an eye, I found myself sitting 5 or 6 feet out from the wall, still in a seated position. My aunt and cousin were in the same exact state, displaced away from the wall as if something had lifted and pushed us together. Confused, I turned to look back at the wall, expecting to see it collapsed, but it was perfectly intact. That's when Maria and my aunt began screaming and running. I suddenly realized how cold I was and felt an icy chill seeping through me, as if I were sitting on ice. I jumped up, spinning around and clutching myself because of how freezing it felt. When we regrouped, my mom and Charlotte said they saw it happen in an instant, but couldn't explain it either. To this day, I still don't understand what happened. My daughter's daycare now sits between that same cemetery and the land where the orphanage once stood, so I pass it every day and always glance at the spot, trying to make sense of it. Just recently, I looked to see if maybe the wall had finally fallen, thinking that might explain what happened. But it's still standing tall, unchanged. Story 34. When I was 18, I worked the evening shift at a pharmacy a few nights a week. We had a standard uniform, a company vest and a name tag. One day I realized I had lost my name tag. I assumed it had fallen out in a friend's car after work, but when it didn't turn up, I asked my boss for a replacement and moved on. About a week or two later, I went to wash my vest and couldn't find it anywhere. I tore my room apart, checked the laundry, even texted my friend to ask if it was in her car. I retraced my steps, thinking maybe I dropped it in the driveway when I got out of her car that night. Nothing. It was just gone. As my next shift approached, I grew more anxious. Losing both my name tag and vest would make me look completely irresponsible. The morning of my shift, I went outside to check the mail like I usually did around 10 o'clock. That's when I froze. There, laid out perfectly in the middle of the lawn, was my vest. Resting neatly on top of it was my original name tag. The vest was spotless, but the name tag looked battered, like it had been through rough handling. I questioned everyone I could think of. My mom, who left for work around 6 that morning, swore she hadn't seen it. None of my friends admitted to pulling a prank. No one confessed to messing with me at all. And I know I hadn't left it there. It has been over 10 years and I still don't know how my uniform disappeared and reappeared like that, or who could have placed it so deliberately on the lawn. No one ever admitted anything, and it remains one of the strangest, most unsettling mysteries of my life. Story 35. When I was about 9 or 10, my house sat right next to a radio station. In front of the building was a massive pine tree with branches so thick that there was a hidden opening underneath where you could slip inside and climb up. My friends and I would often play in it, and except for one worker at the station, no one cared. One afternoon, I was playing there with my friend, who was about 7 or 8. Her sister didn't want to come, so it was just us. Out of everyone I knew, she was the one kid who couldn't climb the tree at all. She couldn't even reach the lowest branch. So we just sat and hung out under the tree's shelter. At one point, she pointed to a car that was acting strangely. It was a purplish vehicle pulled to the side of the road, moving slowly, edging closer to where we were. A cold fear rushed through me. I grabbed her hand and whispered for her to stay quiet and run with me, and not to stop. We bolted out from under the tree, circled around the back of the radio station building, crossed another road, and made it to my fenced backyard. I practically shoved her onto my porch, told her to back away from the door, and stay hidden. We crouched, holding our breath, before slipping into my house. From the front porch, I peeked out. That's when I saw him. A skinny older man with a long white beard stepped out from under the tree, looking frustrated, then got back into the car and drove away. We told her sister what had happened, but that was it. Neither of us ever told our parents. For years, I kept it buried, only admitting it to my boyfriend later in life. Even now, I shudder thinking about it. I don't know what would have happened if my friend had been able to climb that tree, or if we had stayed under those branches a second longer.